Hello shepherds, welcome back. And if you're new here, hello. If you've been following along, I've been sharing with you the ins and outs of one of my favorite fast, easy, and versatile cheeses. In part 1, we covered our main star, and now let's take our cheese to the next level through pressing, waxing, and aging our cheese. This process of aging and preserving our homemade cheeses also works for store-bought cheeses. So if you want to start your cheesy adventure there, I have everything time-stamped so you can jump ahead and save for future reference. Also, I have the recipes included in the video as well as in the description below. So to start, as with any home dairy, it's important to wash your hands and sterilize the equipment that we are using. I like to sterilize my gear with a boiling water bath. Others like the convenience of Star San or a dilute bleach cleaner. Whatever your preference works. I've already done that ahead of time though. So where we last left off, we have our soft cheese curds, draining or perhaps resting in the fridge, ready to get processed. If you haven't removed the curds from your cheesecloth, do so now and add just under half a tablespoon of salt over our curds. If you're wondering why, adding salt not only helps the cheese develop flavor, but also keeps it safe from any unwanted mold or bacteria from taking hold. I'm using the unrefined mined sea salt. It has a bit of speckles in it, but most any salt is good to use. From kosher salt, sea salt, rock salt, and pickling salt. The main thing to keep in mind is to choose a non-iodized salt. Iodized salt can interfere with our cheese, causing problems with our cheese texture and flavor, as iodine can inhibit all our good bacteria and lovely molds from growing. Also, the different salt crystals do impact our flavor, so it's important to be careful with over-salting our cheese. And it's just something to be mindful about. Next up, let's scoop our salted curds into our cheese form. I love how fresh and milky the curds already smell. These curds are pretty soft and squishy compared to a cheddar or cooked curd. They'll firm up with pressing and aging. We don't need to press this heavily, such as with a cheddar, because the curds are so soft they'll knit together quite well. So here I'm using the mason jar filled with whey as a weight. I've heard people using a simple brick wrapped in foil. If you're familiar with Alton Brown, he had a show a long ways back using this technique. I prefer this mold as I like the ease of small, thick wheels of cheese. There's less surface area, so for long-term aging, I find the shape easier to manage for my dinky setup. I like to place my form with the curds in a bowl to catch all that whey so we can reserve it. All this whey is great for breads or even to make a special type of whey cheese. I also like to use it as a nutrient-rich boost for my chickens. And we get eggs as a bonus in return. Okay, so let's press initially for 1 hour, then unmold, redress our cheese, flip, place back into the mold, and then press overnight or 8 to 12 hours. At this point, let's sprinkle the surface with some salt. This helps us develop our rind and prevent any unwanted mold or bacteria from ruining our cheese. Next up, let's place our cheese in a container and take it to our fridge to age, or leave it slightly uncovered to air dry if you're going to wax it. So if you want to continue to age your cheese in this manner, creating a natural rind, rather than waxing, continue listening, but if you want to wax your cheese, go ahead and skip ahead to the next timestamp. So we'll continue by flipping and gently rubbing a light brine on our cheese every day for the first week. It's important to have our container sealed to prevent moisture loss and our cheese elevated out of the way so we can prevent wet spots. This really helps prevent mold buildup from taking hold as well as helping our rind develop. If your fridge is too dry like mine, you do run the risk of developing a really thick rind. More on this later. So to continue to age with brine, we want to keep our cheese in a sealed container, elevated so it doesn't sit in the way, hopefully on a clean surface. In commercial operations, this means stainless steel shelf, but in the home dairy situation, we substitute with sushi mats, natural wood planks, or plastic mesh. Don't forget to continue to flip your cheese weekly and inspect regularly for any mold development. Wipe your surface down with a light brine if any mold appears to bloom. The longer you age your cheese, the more the flavors will develop and concentrate. Even in as short as 2 months, you can get a really nice grating type of cheese. Now, what if you want to wax your cheese? What type of waxes do I use? Or how do I age my waxed cheese? Or is it true that you can store waxed cheese without a fridge or that it's shelf stable? Let's go ahead and get started. First off, what type of wax do I use? The main wax that you may see for aging cheese is a specific wax called cheese wax. This wax is a food-grade wax made to be pliable with just the right amount of softness to easily peel away from our cheese. It helps our cheeses retain moisture, prevent unwanted bacteria and mold from growing in our cheeses as they age. And it helps replicate the ideal environment to age our cheeses. Also, it has a high melting point, which helps sterilize any germs on the surface of our cheese when applied. Now, what about other cheese waxes, such as beeswax or paraffin wax? Paraffin wax is budget friendly. For a lot of people, it might be tempting. However, it has a lower melting point than cheese wax, so you may not get the germ protecting abilities as much with the other wax. Beeswax is also a really nice cheese wax and can be tempting to use. It's not as cost effective though, and just as with paraffin wax, is prone to cracking and shattering because it can be so brittle, allowing the opportunity for any unwanted molds to affect our cheese. It's often suggested for beginners to use cheese wax. I have used beeswax successfully, but it does take a little bit of extra care. If you're wondering why there's different wax colors, mainly it's a visual way to color code and organize our cheeses. Every home dairy has their method and preference, so in terms of aging quality, all the colors work the same. Now, what about other aging techniques that may work similarly to cheese wax? You may have heard about bandage cheeses, leaf wrap cheeses, or even vacuum packed cheeses. I'll get into some of those in another video, with the exception of vacuum packed cheeses. I don't have much experience personally with vacuum packing my cheeses to age, store, or preserve, as I prefer the reusability, low cost, little equipment, and ease of waxing my cheese. I've heard people use vacuum packs with success in aging their cheeses. And the premise in the cheeses, in preparing them and aging, is similar to that with cheese wax. Next up, let's discuss our waxing equipment. We need a wax brush. A natural bristle brush is perfect to use. A plastic brush runs the risk of melting in the high temperatures of our hot wax. One of the downsides, though, of using a natural bristle brush is over the years of use, a natural bristles can shed, which is really annoying, but it is easy to clean out. Also, a side note, it helps to reserve a brush solely for your wax purposes. It can be really difficult or time consuming to clean the wax off the brush thoroughly, especially to get it to its previous state. We also need a reserve pot for our melting wax. If you have the space available for a committed large wax container to dip your whole cheese into, it really does help, and it's fun. Me, I'm using the mason jar. It's small, but does the job. With a large wax pot, it's fun to dip that cheese in, but it does call for a lot of reserve wax, as well as a space commitment that you may not have in a small kitchen. In my little mason jar, I can get down to the very bottom and it's no problem. And I can still coat my cheese. To melt our wax, people often recommend a double boiler method. This is because it's a safe and heat-stable way to melt our waxes, and to keep our wax liquid while we're dipping our cheese. Some things to be careful though when melting our wax is to go slowly. Heat the wax slowly, and as it melts, stir around and try not to get water splashing into the wax. Wax is flammable, so it's really important to be careful. I'm melting my wax in this little toaster oven. This little bit of wax here should cover everything that I need. If you want to use a thermometer for precision, that's okay too. The main temperature we're looking for is anywhere from 200 degrees Fahrenheit, 93 degrees Celsius, to no higher than 210 degrees Fahrenheit or 99 degrees Celsius. We want it to get really hot, but not on fire. Ideally, we want to put about 3 layers of wax onto our cheese. Here, I'm just going by feel and melting my wax in little bits and stirring it around. What I'm looking for in a wax is for it to run like water. It's really important to be very careful with your skin, as it's so hot it can really cause a lot of burns. Just a quick tip is that I like to rest my brush off the edge of my dish so I don't get wax everywhere in between when I'm heating up my wax. If I get a little wax here or there, it's okay. I just scrape it off. It may be helpful to line your surface or countertops with some paper. I'm resting my cheeses on the cutting board. I just want to get this wax into as many cracks and crevices as I can. What happens when we're using this hot of a wax is that it binds to the cheese and creates this airtight seal. So our cheese doesn't lose too much moisture, but more on this later. Let's go ahead and discuss how we can prep our cheese and what type of cheeses are really good for waxing. So what types of cheeses can I wax? For the home dairy, any type of Parmesan style, Alpine style, cheddars, or jacks, for example. They're all ideal for waxing. Basically, any semi-soft or hard style cheese. The same goes for store-bought cheeses if you want to experiment in aging those at home or long-term preservation and storage. But what type of cheeses aren't good for waxing? A lot of mold-ripened cheeses such as bries, camemberts, or any of the really soft cheeses. They're too wet and too fuzzy to take to waxing well, and it doesn't help them develop their beautiful moldy blooms on their surface. So how do you prep a cheese, store-bought or homemade, for waxing and aging? I've seen people commonly recommend dipping the cheese in distilled white vinegar as a way to prevent unwanted mold and bacteria growth successfully. However, I prefer light brine or salting my cheese, then giving them time in the fridge to air dry out and create that thin rind. With either method, the main thing is to make sure the surface of your cheese is clean and dry so that no moisture or wet pockets develop underneath our wax, which may cause this gross mushy layer underneath the surface of the wax. Here are my cheeses. I actually left them in the fridge a little too long, so their rind is quite thick, but that's okay. I also have another cheese that I had cut into, and I want to age the other half some more. The wax won't match though, but that's okay. I have some of my cheeses aging with beeswax and others with cheese wax. As you can see here, this cheese has a blend of cheese wax and beeswax. It's a bit brittle and flaking off. It even sticks to the cheese a little, so it's a little harder to get off when using beeswax. It's really important to put a good thick layer onto it and check it often for any cracking as you handle it. As beeswax is so brittle, it can crack even when you're flipping it. I want to melt this wax and get it really hot, and then make sure to get the wax into all these cracks that have developed into the rind. This will help create an airtight seal, and I'm just turning around and feeling for any weaknesses in the wax. If it's feeling a little thin, or I missed any spots, I just add another coat. The main thing is to work really hot with the first layer so that it coats really well. And I tend to go a little cooler on the outer layers to help thicken it up. If you're choosing to dip your wax in your pot, everyone has their own special technique that they enjoy. The main thing to remember is to get 3 even layers, and with dipping it helps overlap the layers to create that really nice seal. Once we have our cheeses well coated, it's time to put them in their cheese cave for long-term aging. And don't forget, depending on where you are in your aging adventure or the type of cheese you're using, it's important to flip your cheese according to the instructions of your recipe. For the cheese in this video, we're going to flip and inspect daily for the first week, and then flip weekly thereafter. I like to inspect my meals more often than once a week, but if you find any cracks in your wax, unnatural bloating, or wet pockets underneath your wax layer, it's important to pull your cheese from your aging line. If caught early and it's something that's minor, it's easy enough to fix with a light brine wash and re-waxing. So let's discuss aging condition. So first off, is it true that you can store waxed cheese like this for years? If you've ever heard of an aged 2-year-old cheddar, or wondered about a 10-year-old parm, the cheese wax, as well as other aging techniques, creates a perfectly sealed environment for our cheese that can help it age for years. The main thing is to still flip our cheeses and inspect our cheeses regularly. If we notice any wax develop cracks, this often happens around the corners or edges of our wheels, so that's an opportunity for our cheese to go bad or develop unwanted molds and bacteria that affect the flavor and texture of our cheeses. Now, can you store waxed cheeses without a fridge, or is it shelf stable once it's waxed? For those fortunate to live in a mild or cold region, or those that have a really chilly basement, a root cellar, or even have access to a cave, so long as the cheeses have a cave-like environment, so around 45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, or 13 degrees Celsius, it can be shelf stable. Remember, we're trying to replicate the natural environment that our ancestors discovered. The same conditions that made even some of our most famous cheeses that are still being produced to this day at World Heritage Sites. So let's sample some of this aged cheese. This cheese has been aged for about 2 months. I've already cracked into it earlier and waxed it, and now I want to crack into it again. I want to reserve some of this cheese for a recipe, but first let's sample it so we know what we can turn it into. If you look closely here, you can see how crumbly and flaky the cheese is. The wax binded well to the rind, but being mostly beeswax, it's pretty brittle and flakes off rather than peels off easily. To reuse wax, I'll melt it down and filter it through a cheesecloth. Now for a taste test. It's pungent, but in a good way. It reminds me more of a Romano rather than a Parman flavor. It's robust and doesn't have any of those barny tastes, dusty, or sickly fruit notes, which is really good. It has a very earthy flavor and creamy mouthfeel. I can see it working really well on top of salads or in fillings and pastas, or even a grilled cheese, as a way to add more depth of flavor in the cheese blend. It's always fun to cut into a cheese and see how all that work turned out. If you've ever aged mead or wine, it's pretty similar as to how dramatic a fresh green cheese is compared to an aged cheese. And there we have it. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into waxing cheese, and whether you're experimenting with your own custom-made cheeses or dabbling with store-bought, I hope to give you all the information you need to take your cheeses to that next level. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and if you made it this far, leave me a cheese emoji. Until next time, stay soft and whimsical.